Scott, you jumped down from the stage before I could shake your hand and give you a personal thank you, but of course we're in touch outside of this forum anyway. But I just want Scott and everyone to know that how much I appreciate what Scott said. I appreciate his friendship. Many of the speakers here, many of the attendees, I've had the pleasure to become friends with, and I hope to increase that that circle of friends, because you're all very valuable to me. But I have to say, quite honestly, I value the friendship of people like Scott Denning even more so, because it goes beyond the personal connections we make, but it says something about how people can and should get together on a personal level, share cordiality even though we sharply disagree on some issues. And as Scott said, we agree probably on more than we disagree with, and we tend to focus on what we disagree on, much like we do in our own marriages. So, but I greatly appreciate that, Scott, very much. And also, at the risk of incurring the wrath of Dan Miller, who conveniently isn't here, so I think I can do this, I will exercise my Master of Ceremonies prerogative and reopen the question that Dan cut off at the end of the breakfast plenary. And I just want to say that I greatly appreciate the question that was asked by the gentlelady from Energy and Environment. I agree that if we are going to reach solutions, that we need to have a large umbrella, a large tent if we can, and make sure that we're communicating and working with each other. The question that she asked regarding the deficit, I think is really tangential to the topic we're discussing here, but I think it's a good thing that she felt welcome enough to ask such a question, knowing that probably most people in this room share a view that's different than hers. And I think that I think and hope that if we were in another venue where, say, somebody else was the host, that they'd extend us the same courtesy. So I greatly appreciate the question. I'll just say, seeing as it was asked, from my point of view, and maybe from many others here, maybe most people here, I believe that the reason why we're running these frightening deficits is not because people aren't being taxed enough, but it's because government is spending too much. And I thought of an illustration. I'm here in Chicago. There's an American Girl store about 2 or 3 blocks from here. My daughters have begged me to go pick them up some American Girl merchandise. Now, if I'm at home and they ask to purchase something online from American Girl, which they've done in the past, I ask them what it is. They say yes. If I'm busy, I give them my credit card. If I turn around a week or so later, look at my statement, and they bought 3 times the stuff that they had said that I'd given them permission to, I wouldn't increase their allowance as a result. What I'd do is I would say, okay, for the next 3 weeks, you don't get an allowance. And that's where we'd make up the difference. And I know there are some folks that, even some of my free market friends, some libertarian friends, that believe that, hey, once the damage is done, once the money's spent, you have to be responsible and pay your bills. But I think the best way to pay your bills is really to cut off the spending that you've enabled. And then if we indeed start taxing people more money to do so, to pay off this debt, all it's going to do is enable and encourage those folks that spent the money in the first place to say, hey, look, we have plenty of money now that we can borrow, and up the spending once again. That being said, that's one point of view. She has another point of view. I don't think anyone's ever going to reach a point where 100% of the planet agrees with me or the gentlelady who asked the question. I think it's wonderful that we're able to discuss such things openly in this forum. So thank you very much for that question. Our first keynote speaker is Julian Morris. Julian is Executive Director of the International Policy Network, which is an absolutely superb and highly influential free market public policy organization based in London. Julian is an economist with a master's degree in economics, a master's degree in philosophy, along with a graduate degree in law. So as such, I will once again exercise my Master's of Ceremony prerogative and say, Julian, you can feel free to address these issues as well because you are so eminently qualified. We can talk about that question over and over again as long as Dan Miller's not in the room. Julian is a visiting professor at the University of Buckingham. He is co-editor, along with Dr. Inder Gaklani, who also spoke at this conference and at prior conferences, of the Electronic Journal of Sustainable Development. He is also on the editorial board of Energy and Environment. I also want to say that Julian put in tremendous work, a tremendous amount of time and effort, putting together the first international conference on climate change. It is in large part due to Julian's expertise, his skill, his dedication, that this event has taken off as well as it has, and we owe a great debt of gratitude to Julian. I want to thank you very much from the podium. I want to thank you in person afterwards, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Julian Morris.
Thank you very much, James. Actually, I'd like to start by offering a vote of thanks to the person who is ultimately responsible for all of this and who hasn't yet been given the credit, and that's Joe Bass. So can we please have a round of applause for Joe? I'm also greatly honoured to be among such an eminent group of economists and political analysts, and of course, so many great climate scientists. I should say, though, as Viscount Monkton's warm-up act, my job is primarily to help you attune your ears to what we call the Queen's English. And Joe reminded me that means I've got to speak slowly. Actually, I do want to share with you some more serious points. Having been involved in the climate change debate since about 1992, I think there is merit in a bit of a historical perspective. So I want to trace the origins of warmism, or climatism, or as Andrei Larinov has called it, Kyotoism, as well as the other related environmentalisms, because I don't think that we can entirely disentangle these things. And I want to draw lessons from this historical analysis and to suggest a possible way forward. But before that, I think I should explain the title of the talk. If you look in your program, you'll see that it's called 2012, A Parable for Carbon Traders. You're probably thinking, what on earth is that all about? Well, you may be familiar with the disaster movie 2012. I haven't actually seen it, but I understand that it describes a massive solar flare which causes a reversal in the polarity of the Earth. And this event occurs on December the 21st, 2012. The end of the world, supposedly, in Mayan mythology, and hence the poster "We Were Warned." I thought, well, this is sort of a nice analogy in the world of, for the world of carbon trading, which, if as a result of a reversal in the polarity of conventional wisdom and political dogma, there were no successor to the Kyoto Protocol, which ends 10 days later on the 31st of December 2012, the alleged Mayan end of the world, and then I was going to explain how the Mayan civilization came to an end long before 2012, because of a centralized authoritarian government which inhibited technological progress and adaptation to climate change, which I think has some implications for the discussions going on here. However, after digging a little, I discovered that there's not much evidence that the Mayans believed the world was going to end in 2012. Rather, some rather over-enthusiastic anthropologists had inferred this on the basis of the Mayan creation myth. The Mayan creation myth holds that a previous Mayan civilization had ended on what they call the 13th Baktun. I don't know if that's pronounced correctly, but anyway, it's the 144,000th day of the civilization. So the idea was that the previous Mayan civilization ended on the 144,000th day. And then these anthropologists calculated that the 144,000th day of the current Mayan civilization would be December the 21st, 2012. The anthropologists simply assumed that the Mayans believed that the world would end then. But as with Roland Emmerich's previous disaster movies, Independence Day, and of course, The Day After Tomorrow, 2012 may make for fun viewing, but it should not be relied on as an accurate representation of the historical, scientific, or even cultural facts. I think there's a wider lesson here as well, which is that we must be careful when evaluating claims made by those who seek to profit from stories of doom. Unfortunately, we as a species seem to be rather susceptible to certain kinds of scare stories. As Jay Lair mentioned at breakfast, the intelligentsia, what we in Britain call the chattering classes, were taken in by Rachel Carson's purple prose in Silent Spring, which in the 1960s helped kickstart the modern environmentalist movement, and especially opposition to agrochemicals. I'll come back to that later. But from the late 1960s, there were another group of people who got very, very involved in this. The likes of Paul Ehrlich, John Holdren, Barry Commoner, Kenneth Boulding, and Garrett Harding. They regurgitated claims which had been created many, many eons ago, Tertullian among others, and Malthus more recently, that rising populations and rising affluence, combined with new technologies, would result in environmental destruction and undermine human civilization. In December 1967, The New Scientist, a British publication, published a paper by Paul Ehrlich called Playing the Piper, in which he stated, "The battle to feed humanity is over. In the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death, in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now." Similar prognostications came from the Club of Rome, which in 1972 claimed a more scientific basis on account of using a computer model. The trouble is that regardless of whether the computer is carbon or silicon-based, if the model is garbage, then the output will be junk. Sadly, however, circumstances shone favorably on the alarmists for a while in the 1970s. The oil crisis of 1973 reinforced fear of resource depletion. What was the solution? Well, regulate fossil fuels and subsidize renewables. When in the late 1970s, North Sea oil broke the OPEC cartel and prices of oil collapsed, fears switched to overconsumption. So in the 1980s, we heard of acid rain. Do you remember acid rain? Then when temperatures seemingly started rising again, well, we came to global warming. And the solution to both acid rain and global warming was to regulate fossil fuels and subsidize renewables. Now, it seems to me that when the same solution is proposed to two almost opposite problems, under-availability of resources or overconsumption of resources, then I think we should suspect that there is a solution in search of a problem. Meanwhile, reality was dealing an empirical blow to the hubristic computations of the population alarmists. Advances in crops and cultivation technologies, better, cheaper fertilizers, pesticides and agrochemicals, mechanical planting and harvested technologies, as well as drip-feed agriculture, made possible by fossil fuels, and not to forget, of course, the increasing concentration of carbon dioxide, led to a dramatic increase in crop production, and in many cases, a reduced environmental impact. Food production increased faster than population growth, and the deaths from starvation fell in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. Yet Paul Ehrlich received a MacArthur Genius Award. Meanwhile, John Holdren became Obama's science advisor. Moreover, ideological opposition to modern agricultural technologies is beginning to take its toll on advances in productivity. Regulation of genetically modified organisms is stifling their rollout in many places, especially in very low productivity regions such as sub-Saharan Africa, where their potential to increase yields is very significant. Here, environmentalist opposition to technology threatens to bring about the very thing that environmentalists themselves claim to be concerned about: death from starvation. This is perverse. It is also morally repugnant. I'm now going to go back to the story that we heard from Jay Lair earlier today, because the same applies to DDT. And that's why IPN, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Africa Fighting Malaria, and a number of other organizations have opposed restrictions on the use of DDT for malaria control. And by making the humanitarian case, we have so far won. Yes, You may not hear this very often, but we won the debate on DDT so far. DDT was not banned. Yes, it was banned here in the United States, but it was not banned under the international treaty that restricted the use of various other organic chemicals. And it is now being used again for malaria control in Africa. So here we have, I think, a success, and we should be proud of ourselves for combating this egregious attempt to restrict a technology which is so beneficial to so many millions of people. And I believe that we can do the same with regard to anthropogenic global warming, AGW. Alarmists claim that AGW will most adversely affect people in poor countries because they are least able to adapt. Okay, that's fair enough. But people in these countries are already suffering from most of the problems that AGW will supposedly make worse. So if, instead of harping on about the need for carbon control, an incredibly inefficient way of addressing a complex problem, if indeed it's a problem at all, politicians in rich and poor countries alike should focus on removing barriers to enterprise and trade. Then the poor would be better able to escape poverty, and they would be better able to access the technologies that could improve their lives. Not to mention reduce the threats that they face from malnutrition to diarrhea to malaria, and indeed any other problem which might arise as a result of climate change, whether caused by man or not. If they were to do this, then I think that by 2030, never mind 2050, never mind 2100, or the problem that Stern looks at, 2200 to 2300, never mind those far-off dates, that the incidence of deaths from disease, natural disasters, and other climate-related phenomena could be dramatically reduced, if not eliminated. I mean, that's a really serious proposition to look at if you're trying to save people from harm. But if the world goes down the path of carbon control, the beneficiaries will be those vested interests who currently benefit from the emission trading scheme in Europe and from the egregious subsidies to biofuels and other renewable sources of energy. Meanwhile, the losers will be everyone else, especially the poor. We all, and especially the poor, will suffer from more expensive and less accessible food and fuel, very things that make life livable. More people will likely die from climate-related problems. This is perverse. It is also morally repugnant. So that's why, again, I must applaud the Heartland Institute for convening this conference. It's also why International Policy Network set up an organisation called the Civil Society Coalition on Climate Change, which is a coalition of 50 organisations around the world promoting practical solutions to these fundamental problems relating to climate that people in poor countries especially face. We have a website. We produce a series of studies. Partners around the world have been very effective in communicating the messages that the coalition has produced. From the Liberty Institute in India, run by Barun Mitra, who's here, to the Cathay Institute for Public Affairs in China, many other organizations who produced and distributed studies that have promoted these practical solutions, with positive feedback from media and politicians. The Indian government has cited the 2007 Civil Society report, saying that this is a reason not to go down the path of global climate control. We're producing another series of reports this year, and I encourage those civil society groups in this room and anywhere else who's listening on the web to join our organisation. And I encourage others to support us. I'd emphasise that this initiative is entirely supported by individuals and foundations and not by any companies. So that you can get in touch with us, the website for the Civil Society Coalition is www.csccc.info. That's www.csccc.info. My organisation, International Policy Network, is www.policynetwork.net. I do very much hope that we can all work together to promote more morally acceptable solutions to the problem of climate change and poverty. Thank you very much.